One evening, when I unexpectedly returned home, everything changed forever. Sandy stood in front of the mirror, wearing an unfamiliar black dress and applying bright red lipstick. "Do you need something?" she asked coldly. I hesitated before her sharp response. "I have a date." A wave of pain and helplessness swept over me, but I kept my composure. Instead of pleading or arguing, I simply replied, "If that's your decision, then pack your things and leave tonight." Silence filled the air before everything erupted into a chain of unforeseen events, where karma finally stepped in and turned the tables completely. Meaningful coincidences happen. But before we dive into the story, let me know where you're watching this from in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next exciting stories. The first people to ever host an episode of the original short story podcast, Dive Deep. We'd been married for years, long enough to collect a scrapbook of shared memories. Some were filled with joy. Weekend road trips, late-night dancing in the kitchen, and the way her laughter would light up even the dullest days. Others were marked by challenges, the inevitable arguments, the small compromises that marriage demands. Through it all, we found ways to weather the storms. Or so I thought, considering how many times I'd failed. The fire changed everything. One moment our home was a sanctuary, a space we had poured our love into. The next, it was gone, reduced to ash and memories in a blaze that devoured more than just wood and brick. We moved into my grandmother's old house, a creaky, drafty relic of another era. It wasn't ideal, but it was a roof over our heads, a place to start over. Yet for Sandy, it seemed more like a prison than a fresh start. Her warmth began to cool, and the vibrant energy she once brought into our lives dimmed, like the flicker of a dying candle. At first, I chalked it up to stress. Losing a home is no small thing, and rebuilding a life from the ashes is exhausting. But it wasn't long before her behavior started to shift in ways I couldn't ignore. Subtle at first, an extra long work meeting here, a late night with friends there. Her phone, once left casually on the counter, was now a constant presence in her hand, its screen angled away from my view. When I asked about it, she'd shrug, a ghost of her old laughter in her voice. "Just work stuff, you know how it is." Our conversations became one-sided, my words filling the silence where her laughter used to echo. She stopped wearing her wedding ring some days, offering flimsy excuses about how it didn't fit quite right, or how she'd simply forgotten. It wasn't the big things that gave me pause. It was the accumulation of small moments that painted a picture I didn't want to see. I wanted to believe it was just a phase, a temporary distance born of grief and stress. But late at night, lying awake in the shadows of a house that wasn't quite home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was unraveling. It wasn't just the house we'd lost in the fire, it was us. And though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what was wrong, I knew one thing for certain. The woman beside me wasn't the same Sandy I'd married. At first, I tried not to read too much into it. Sandy and I had been through rough patches before, and I told myself this was just another one of those. But her distance became harder to ignore as the days turned into weeks. Conversations that once flowed like a familiar melody were now like talking to a wall. I'd ask her about her day, and her responses were clipped, mechanical, like she was checking a box rather than engaging with me. One evening, I thought I'd try to rekindle something small, something simple. "Do you want to watch your favorite show tonight?" I asked, keeping my tone light. It was something we used to do religiously, curling up on the couch together. She barely looked up from her phone. "No, I'm tired," she said, her voice flat. Later that night, I caught her stifling a giggle at something on her screen. It wasn't the kind of laugh you give to a meme or a funny video. It was warm, alive, and directed at someone, not me. The changes were subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. Her wardrobe began to shift. Jeans and casual sweaters were replaced with sleek dresses and carefully chosen accessories. She claimed it was for work, but her job hadn't changed. I noticed her spending more time in front of the mirror, applying makeup with a level of care I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't that she looked beautiful. She always had. It was the purpose behind it that gnawed at me. She wasn't dressing for me. Then there were her work meetings. They started cropping up with a frequency that didn't make sense. She'd come home late, the faintest hint of perfume lingering in the air. Meetings ran over, she'd say, avoiding eye contact. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. But the pieces didn't fit. The Sandy I knew didn't hide things, didn't tilt her phone away when I walked into the room, didn't forget to wear her wedding ring. Each little moment chipped away at my resolve. I'd sit alone in the living room, replaying our interactions, searching for some clue that I was wrong. Maybe it really was just stress. Maybe she just needed space. But then, the doubts would creep in, whispering the questions I didn't want to ask. Why didn't she laugh like that with me anymore? Who was on the other end of those texts she guarded so fiercely? There were nights I nearly confronted her, the words bubbling to the surface only to be swallowed down again. I'd watch her scrolling through her phone, her face illuminated by the glow of the screen, and wonder if I'd already lost her. 1,000 scenarios played out in my mind, each one more painful than the last. Was it another man? Was she bored with me? Or was I imagining it all? The turning point came one quiet evening. I walked into the living room unannounced and saw her on the couch, her face lit up with a smile I hadn't seen in months. She was laughing, her whole body leaning into the moment, alive in a way that made my chest ache. I stood there, unnoticed, watching as she typed something on her phone. Whoever she was talking to, they had her full attention. Her laughter wasn't for me anymore. I turned away, my stomach twisting with a mix of anger, sorrow, and something I couldn't quite name. That was when the denial began to crumble. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just in my head. Sandy was pulling away, and I didn't know if I could pull her back. The house was eerily quiet when I got home that winter evening, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and amplifies every creak of the floorboards. Outside, the early darkness of the season had settled in, blanketing the street in a cold, heavy stillness. I stepped into the house and immediately felt something was off. The usual hum of life, Sandy's music playing softly, the smell of something simmering on the stove, was absent. Instead, there was a faint scent of her perfume, one I hadn't smelled in months, lingering like a ghost in the air. "Sandy?" I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. No response. "Oh." The upstairs light filtered down the staircase, drawing me forward. Each step creaked under my weight as I climbed, a growing knot of tension coiling in my stomach. As I reached the top, I saw her. Standing at the dresser, applying makeup. She didn't see me at first. Her reflection in the mirror was focused, deliberate, as she leaned closer to perfect the bold red lipstick. A dress hugged her figure, sleek and black, with a neckline that demanded attention. It was new, one I had never seen before, and shorter than anything she typically wore. A pair of high heels sat neatly by her side, ready to complete the look. "Are we going somewhere?" I asked, breaking the quiet. My voice sounded calmer than I felt, but I was determined not to let the growing storm in my chest take over. She paused mid-supplication, her eyes flicking to mine in the mirror. There was no guilt in her expression, not even surprise, just irritation, like I was an unwelcome interruption. "No," she said flatly, turning back to the mirror. "I have a date." The words hung in the air, sharp and cold. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to stay composed. "A date," I repeated, my tone even. "With someone else." For the first time, I dared look. His eyes were full of radicism like mine. Her lips curved into a smirk as she capped the lipstick. "Yes, with someone who actually appreciates me." I stood there, staring at the woman I thought I knew, now a stranger in my own home. My mind raced, searching for the right words, but the tightness in my chest wouldn't let them come easily. Finally, I spoke. "If that's the case," I said, keeping my voice measured, "then you should pack your things and go. If you're serious about seeing someone else, you can't stay here. It's that simple." She turned to face me fully now, her irritation flaring into indignation. "I'm not going anywhere," she snapped, crossing her arms. "I like this house. When it's mine, I'll do whatever I want with it." I let out a slow breath, my hands resting on the door frame. "Sandy, I'm not going to argue with you about this. If you want out, fine. But this, living under the same roof while you're off seeing someone else, isn't happening." Her eyes narrowed, a bitter smile playing on her lips. "Oh, you think you can just throw me out? Try it. I'll call the cops and tell them you threatened me, maybe even hit me. You know how it works. They'll haul you off for 48 hours, and by the time you get back, the locks will be changed." The venom in her words struck deep, but I refused to let her see it. "You really think threats are going to work on me?" I asked, my voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. "You want this house? You can have it, once you've moved out and we've settled everything. But until then, you don't get to play these games." Her laugh was sharp, almost mocking. "You think you're in control here, don't you? You're pathetic." I took a step closer, meeting her gaze. "No, Sandy. I think I've finally had enough. Do yourself a favor and leave tonight. Go stay with your parents or whoever it is you're dressing up for." She rolled her eyes, muttering something under her breath as she grabbed a small clutch from the dresser. "I'll be back in 30 minutes, she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "You'd better not be here when I get back, or I'll make sure you regret it." With that, she brushed past me, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. The door slammed behind her, leaving me alone in the suffocating quiet once more. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the empty doorway, the weight of her words settling over me like a lead blanket. But instead of despair, I felt something else take root. A calm, cold resolve. If she thought she could manipulate me, control me, she was wrong. This wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and the home I had fought to rebuild. She could threaten, insult, and dismiss me all she wanted, but she would learn soon enough that I wasn't the man she thought she could walk over anymore. The garage was dark, save for the faint glow of a single bulb swinging overhead, casting erratic shadows across the walls. I stood there, gripping the aluminum bat, its cold weight grounding me in the midst of chaos. The rhythmic thud of my heart echoed in my ears as I stared at her car parked just outside. It was a symbol of her disdain, her defiance, a tool for her to escape while I stayed trapped in the ruins of what we once were. I swung the bat with deliberate force. The first hit shattered a taillight, the red plastic splintering like the trust she'd so carelessly discarded. Another swing took out the headlight, and the driveway plunged into darkness. Each swing was calculated, each impact a way to regain some semblance of control over the unraveling situation. Her phone was next. Sitting on the kitchen counter, it practically sneered at me, a conduit for the life she was living without me. I removed the battery and took it to the garage. One solid hit with the hammer, and it snapped into pieces. I carefully placed the shattered remnants back into her purse, minus the battery. Tonight, there would be no calls, no texts. If she wanted to leave, she'd have to do it on foot. When she came downstairs, fully dressed for her night out, the black dress hugged her frame in ways that felt like a deliberate mockery. Her lipstick, a striking red, was bold and defiant. She stopped in her tracks when she saw me, her expression hardening into irritation. "Out," she snapped, pointing toward the door. "I don't have time for this." I didn't move. Instead, I poured myself a cup of coffee, the steaming liquid filling the silence between us. I leaned casually against the counter and took a slow sip. "Good luck with your night," I said evenly, not a hint of malice in my tone. Her eyes narrowed. "What did you do?" she demanded, her voice sharp. I gestured toward the driveway. "Why don't you check your car?" Her heels clacked loudly against the floor as she stormed outside. Moments later, I heard her furious shout, a mix of anger and disbelief. She stomped back into the house, her face flushed with rage. "You bastard," she hissed. "I'll just call someone to pick me up." "Go ahead," I replied, gesturing toward her purse. "You'll need your phone for that." Her hand darted into the bag, pulling out the phone. When it didn't turn on, her anger erupted anew. "You broke my phone!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the house. "Maybe you should have kept a better eye on it," I said, my tone calm, almost bored. She swapped her heels for sneakers, muttering curses under her breath, and headed for the garage. I followed quietly, staying out of sight as she climbed into the driver's seat of my Suburban, the Beast, as she used to call it. The engine roared to life, a deep growl that filled the garage. She pressed the button to open the garage door, but nothing happened. Her frustration was palpable as she hit the button again and again. Finally, in a fit of impatience, she slammed her foot on the gas. The Beast lunged forward, smashing into the garage door with a deafening screech of tearing metal and splintering wood. The force was so great it sent shockwaves through the house. But the real disaster was waiting just outside. Parked directly behind the garage, a police cruiser bore the brunt of her reckless move. The Beast smashed into the car with such force that it crumpled the cruiser's front end. One of the officers had just opened the door when the impact sent him sprawling to the ground. The chaos erupted instantly. The other officer, a redhead I vaguely remembered from high school, was already moving. She yanked Sandy from the car, dragging her out by her arm. "Get on the ground," the officer shouted, her voice sharp and commanding. Sandy screamed incoherently, thrashing against the officer's grip. "You don't understand. He did this. This isn't my fault." I rushed toward the downed officer, who was clutching his nose, blood streaming between his fingers. "Hold still," I said, keeping his head stable. "Help is on the way." The scene was a blur of flashing lights and raised voices. Neighbors gathered on their porches, their silhouettes framed against the cold winter night. Sandy, handcuffed and sobbing, was loaded into the back of a cruiser. Her accusations and curses were drowned out by the chaos around us. I stood in the driveway, watching as the wreckage was cleared. The Beast was hauled away, its front end mangled, a testament to her reckless desperation. The officers asked me questions, their faces a mix of professionalism and pity. I answered calmly, recounting the events without embellishment. As Sandy's car was towed and the last of the emergency vehicles departed, I felt a strange sense of relief. The storm had finally broken, and with it, the fragile facade of our marriage. This wasn't just about a damaged garage or a totaled car. It was about the undeniable truth that Sandy's chaos was her own undoing. For the first time in months, I could breathe. The courtroom was sterile, its gray walls and muted carpet a fitting backdrop for the battle unfolding. Sandy sat across from me, her posture rigid, a mix of defiance and barely concealed frustration etched on her face. Her lawyer, a man with the slick comb-overs and a smarmy smile, spoke first, his voice brimming with confidence. "She wants the house, or half its value," he declared, sliding a neatly stacked bundle of papers across the table toward my lawyer. "Given the circumstances, it's only fair." I glanced at my lawyer, a composed and meticulous woman who didn't even flinch. She calmly opened her briefcase and retrieved a document, her movements deliberate, as though she'd been anticipating this exact moment. "The house isn't community property," she replied, sliding the document back across the table. "It belongs to my client's father. Legally, Sandy has no claim to it." There was a flicker of doubt on Sandy's face, but she quickly masked it, leaning in to whisper something to her lawyer. He frowned as he read through the document, his brow furrowing deeper with every word. Finally, he looked up, his smirk faltering. "This can't be right," he muttered, though the hesitation in his voice betrayed his own doubt. "It's entirely correct," my lawyer said smoothly. "And as for the furniture and appliances, we have receipts showing they were purchased with funds from my client's father's account. They're also not considered marital property." Sandy's frustration became palpable. Her hands clenched into fists on the table as her lawyer scrambled to salvage the argument. "What about the insurance payout from the fire?" he asked, desperation creeping into his tone. "It was used to cover debts incurred jointly, leaving no remaining funds to dispute," my lawyer replied, her voice steady and unwavering. Sandy's composure cracked. She crossed her arms and glared at me, her eyes filled with a mix of betrayal and fury. "You're leaving me with nothing," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to draw a quiet murmur from the courtroom. "That's not entirely true," my lawyer said, her tone almost sardonic. "We're willing to let her keep one of the bedroom sets, out of nostalgia." The room fell silent. Sandy's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the futility of their position. Sandy, on the other hand, couldn't hide her anger. She stormed out of the courtroom shortly after, leaving her lawyer to handle the rest of the negotiations. In the end, the settlement was modest. Sandy kept her car and a portion of the money she'd withdrawn from our joint account, but little else. She had overplayed her hand, and the court saw through her posturing. As the judge finalized the divorce, he commended me for my foresight in protecting my assets. It wasn't about vindication or revenge. It was about ensuring stability and reclaiming my life. His lawyer: "When the gavel struck, it wasn't just the end of our marriage. It was the closure I'd been seeking." Sandy's arrogance, her belief that she could manipulate and intimidate her way to victory, had crumbled under the weight of her own actions. Walking out of that courtroom, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free, and for the first time in years, I could finally focus on building a life that was mine alone. The first morning after Sandy was officially gone, the house was eerily quiet. Not the heavy, suffocating silence of recent months, but a peaceful stillness that felt like a blank slate. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching the soft light of dawn seep through the trees. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was bracing for the next fight or betrayal. I felt free. Rebuilding my life was both a challenge and a relief. The house, with its creaky floors and faded wallpaper, became my project. I threw myself into fixing it up, not for Sandy or anyone else, but for myself. The act of painting walls, repairing broken hinges, and replacing worn-out fixtures felt almost meditative, each completed task a step toward reclaiming my sense of purpose. I reconnected with hobbies I had long neglected. The shooting range, once a place where I could lose myself in focus and precision, became a regular escape. On one of those afternoons, I ran into Sergeant Sweet, the officer who had arrested Sandy that chaotic night in the garage. She was there in jeans and a casual jacket, a stark contrast to the uniformed professionalism I remembered. We exchanged pleasantries at first, but soon our conversations grew longer, lingering in the shared space of the range. There was an unspoken understanding between us. She too had experienced the dissolution of a marriage, though hers hadn't involved quite as much destruction. "Care for coffee after this?" I asked one afternoon, more nervous than I'd been in years. To my surprise, she smiled, her eyes softening. "Sure, as long as you promise not to talk about work." That first coffee led to dinner, and dinner led to more. With sweet Jessica, as I came to know her, I found something I hadn't realized I was missing: trust. It wasn't just about the grand gestures or declarations of love. It was in the small things. The way she'd lean across the table to refill my drink without asking. The way she'd listened, really listened, when I spoke. The way her laugh was genuine, unguarded. We took things slow, both of us cautious but hopeful. I found joy in the little moments, teaching her how to cook a dish my grandmother had taught me, hiking trails neither of us had ever explored, sitting together in comfortable silence on the porch as the sun set. It wasn't long before we both realized we wanted the same things: a partnership built on mutual respect, understanding, and the lessons we had learned from the past. 9 months after that first coffee, we stood in front of a small group of friends and family, exchanging vows that were simple but heartfelt. She wasn't just my wife, she was my partner, my equal, and my friend. Looking back now, those months of rebuilding weren't just about fixing a house or finding someone new. They were about finding myself again. The scars of the past didn't disappear, but they became reminders of how far I had come. Life didn't just return to normal. It became better, richer, and more fulfilling than I had ever thought possible. And as I stood beside Jessica, watching her laugh at a joke one of the kids told, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. Standing on the porch of my grandmother's house, now worn but still standing strong, I watched my daughter's face light up as she accepted the keys. The joy in her eyes mirrored the hope I had when Sandy and I first moved in years ago. But this time, the house wasn't a place of transition. It was a gift, a fresh start for a new chapter in our family's story. It felt like life coming full circle. The road to this moment hadn't been easy. There were days when the weight of betrayal and chaos felt insurmountable. But those struggles shaped me. They taught me resilience, patience, and the value of self-respect. Sandy's actions had nearly torn me apart, but they also forced me to look inward, to rediscover the parts of myself I had lost in the turmoil of our marriage. First, I struggled to make sense of it all. Why did it happen? Could I have done something differently? But over time, those questions faded, replaced by a quiet understanding. Not all battles are meant to be won, and not all endings are failures. Sandy's chaos was a catalyst, not an end, but a beginning. The decision to rebuild my life was deliberate. I found solace in small actions. Fixing up the house, spending evenings at the shooting range, reconnecting with old friends. Each step was a piece of the puzzle, bringing clarity to who I was outside of the marriage. Meeting Sergeant Sweet was unexpected but profoundly healing. Her steady presence was a contrast to the storm I'd weathered, and in her, I found something I didn't realize I'd been missing: trust. Our life together has been simple but fulfilling. We've built a partnership on mutual respect and honesty, free of the manipulations and insecurities that once defined my world. Celebrating our anniversary on a river cruise in Europe, surrounded by laughter and love, felt like a testament to the strength that grew from the wreckage of my past. As I handed over the house to my daughter, I felt nothing but gratitude, not for the chaos, but for what it taught me. The house, once a symbol of pain and transition, was now a beacon of renewal. Life rarely unfolds as planned, but sometimes the detours take you exactly where you're meant to be. And standing there, watching my daughter embrace her future, I wouldn't change a thing. Life rarely unfolds the way we expect. Its twists and turns, the chaos and heartbreak can feel insurmountable in the moment. But as I look back on the storms I weathered, losing my home, my marriage, and the sense of stability I once clung to, I see now that those trials were shaping me for something greater. They were teaching me resilience, patience, and the value of self-worth. The detours I once resented led me to a life I couldn't have imagined, a life rooted in trust, mutual respect, and quiet joy. They showed me that growth often comes not in spite of adversity, but because of it. Standing here today, watching my daughter settle into the old house that once carried so much pain, I can't help but feel a sense of closure and renewal. What began as a symbol of loss has become a gift of hope for the next generation. Life doesn't always go as planned, I tell her, smiling as she thanks me. But sometimes it's the detours that lead us exactly where we're meant to be. And for the first time in years, I know those words to be true.